the Muslim voice should be heard.
Across the country, Labour's vote share plummeted in heavily Muslim-concentrated constituencies.
It's never really been done in British electoral politics before.
The Muslim vote is a sectarian vote. George Galloway lost his seat in Rochdale, and the Workers' Party got 0 across the country.
Because of her personality, because of her background, because of her age, because of, kind of that connection with the youth vote, because of what she represented, because of going against West Streeting, it was like a trifecta of factors that came together to make Leanne's candidature the way it was. In Bradford is something that we never really talked about. There was a drop in Labour vote of about 44%.
Wow.
And that's the highest drop of Labour vote anywhere in the country.
Really? These past few weeks, we have seen frenetic activity here in the UK. Our constitutional vagaries allowed then Prime Minister Rishi Sunak to call a snap general election, a calculation that backfired. The new Labour government sits on a landslide, 174 majority and an accumulation of 412 seats. With a gushing liberal media and a weak opposition, these next few years will resemble very closely what Lord Hailsham called an elective dictatorship. Yet amid this landslide, there's another story, that of the Muslim community and what the press calls the Gaza vote. Across the country, Labour's vote share plummeted in heavily Muslim-concentrated constituencies. In 4 seats, Leicester South, Blackburn, Dewsbury and Batley and Perry Barr, against all the odds, 4 Muslim MPs were elected as independents. Only 3 independents have been elected at the ballot box since the Second World War. This is a seismic change in British politics, but can it be sustained, or are Muslims destined to re-engage with the Labour Party and return to a politics of old? This week, I invite Riaz Hasan, an economist and data scientist, who has worked with me throughout this period on the election campaigns. Riaz and I worked together over these past few weeks to inject some data into the conversation about Muslim electoral weight. He was instrumental, I believe, in offering the community's advice in moving forward using the clarity of numbers to run good quality local campaigns. Riaz Hasan, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome back to the Thinking Muslim.
Wa alaikum salam, Jalal. Good to be here again.
Well, it's wonderful to have you with us, Riaz. I think the last time we spoke about AI, and subhanAllah, I think in many ways a lot of your data mind was used in this coming election. I think there are lots of constituencies across the country that benefited from a lot of the data that you supplied them. So let's start with some of the facts, Riaz. Tell me about the lay of the land, the Muslim vote share. How did it really stack up?
Okay, so I think what's perhaps more interesting to analyze is to understand why we need to analyze these numbers post-election.
Right.
Because post-election, we can't just forget about the result and say that we've achieved so much, because in the data itself, in the results that we've achieved, we have to understand why that was made up in the way it was.
Yeah.
It's important to understand because one of the foremost reasons is that we were going from a standing start. We'd never ever done something like this before as a Muslim community in this country. We'd never even attempted to do something like this. In fact, some of the voices that we heard about not attempting to do this was that it was ultimately led to failure, right? So it was something that was not even considered, and that was not even on the landscape. People were warning us against it. There was a multitude of reasons why people thought that this could never be achieved. Yeah. Yet when you look at the way the system is stacked up in this country in terms of first past the post, and then you compare that to the demographics of the Muslim populace in this country, we have a concentration that lends itself very well to understanding how we can achieve results in first past the post. I think when me and you first discussed this in around about October time, I guess, we discovered that, hang on a second, there is a correlation here between how the Muslim demographics are set up in this country and what we can potentially achieve. Yeah. And from that, I think the idea arose within our minds and within other people's minds is to how do we exploit that moving forward? Yeah. And that's where we kind of assumed that there were certain pockets within this country that were very viable to having independent candidates, right? To having candidates primarily on the pro-Gaza issue moving forward.
So these are concentrated Muslim communities where there are enough viable voters for an independent candidate to win.
That's correct, yes. So initially when people were looking at this situation, they were very much comparing it to the size of the majority that was in place for some of the incumbent candidates or incumbent parliamentarians that were in these constituencies. So we had, for example, Roshnara Ali in Tower Hamlets, which had a whopping great majority of about 35,000, I believe. We had some people in Birmingham that had huge majorities, like Tahir Ali, for example.
Jonathan Ashworth, Leicester South, huge majority.
Exactly, Jonathan Ashworth, Blackburn as well, right, 25,000. So all of these majorities were there, and people were saying, well, how do you overcome such a huge majority? It's never really been done in British electoral politics before. But I think if you look at the way the transformation happens, normally what they talk about is small swings of movement between Labour and the Conservatives, traditionally or classically in British electoral politics. So they talk about swings of 2.1%, 3.1% to turn a seat from Labour into the Tories. But because we're on fresh ground here, this is a fresh perspective. There's never been the injection of an independent candidate in some of these constituencies. And that's what really led us to believe that this is actually possible. Not everywhere, but in a number of places.
How many seats, in your mind, is this possible? We've won 4 seats.
That's correct.
How many seats is this possible?
So I think it's very viable in about 20, 25 seats, whereby there is enough of a concentration, there is enough momentum, there is enough of a disjoint between the other political parties for us to inject people of an independent nature who can represent the Muslim voice really in these constituencies.
Before we get to then the successes, of course, post-election there's been a big debate about sectarianism. And the very fact is, according to the press at least, that the Muslim vote is a sectarian vote. I mean, Nigel Farage talks a lot about this. What you've just described as seems to fall into that narrative. Look, how would you view the Muslim vote? Yeah,
so I think this kind of perception of sectarianism within the Muslim communities, it's really driving home a fear factor. So when people talk about the words in quotes, sectarianism, normally the images that are drawn up are of Northern Ireland in the 1970s or in the 80s, where there's a battle between the green and the orange, the Protestants and the Catholics. And somehow that is transferred to that meaning of that word and then superimposed upon the Muslim community, that if you label it as sectarianism, that somehow one follows the other, and therefore this is a recipe for violence and for disaster in many ways. But I look at it slightly differently. I don't make any excuses for understanding that, the Muslim voice should be heard in these communities. Why shouldn't it be heard? It's been submerged beneath the veneer of Labour and Tory politics for so long now that the Muslim voice has no option, has never been heard on these fronts. It's been subsumed into Labour voices. It's been diluted with Labour agendas. It's been diluted with some Tory agendas. It's been diluted with personal ambitions of certain people. So therefore, I don't really make an excuse for saying that the Muslim voice should be heard in this level. Now, if people want to call it sectarianism, I guess that's their prerogative, right? But for us, I think it's important to understand that the Muslim voice should be heard, right? And we make no excuse for understanding that the Muslim vote base is a vote base that we should really go after and understand, and how to carry the values and carry their concerns across in this manner.
Okay, so at the very beginning, I talked about 4 seats. I mean, 5 if we include Corbyn, but he didn't win that seat on the Muslim vote. So we've got 4 seats where pro-Gaza Muslim candidates won those seats. I mean, in your mind, how remarkable was that achievement?
Well, I think it's very remarkable because, as you said in your introduction, throughout the history of this century, there's only been 3 independent candidates who have actually won seats. And to have 4 independent candidates in one election cycle to win seats is absolutely remarkable. Considering also the fact that when we started this project, or when people like us started this project, including us, the fact was that we had no electoral capital to move from. We were moving
that electoral capital.
Yeah, so we were moving from a standing start. What I mean by electoral capital is that some of these political parties have gone through iterations of electoral cycles in terms of moving ahead, in terms of understanding two key aspects, really. One is the aspect of data that they've collated over these previous electoral cycles. And then the other is know-how in how to run effective campaigns, how to target effective demographics, and how to then maneuver themselves into positions of victory. So that's something that they've built up over the years with the know-how that they have. So when people like these independent candidates and others around the country that started this project, there was nothing. There was a clean slate. There was no effective experience of know-how. There was no effective use of data. There wasn't actually any data available at all. The data is the ones that we actually drew up during the course of this campaign. So considering all of that, considering the fact that we had no electoral capital to move from, to achieve 4 independent candidates with clear victories in some of these areas is a remarkable achievement.
Yes.
Because the fact that the election was called so soon, and the fact that it was only a short electoral campaign cycle of about, I think, 6 weeks, right? So 6 weeks. In 6 weeks, they had to learn how the know-how of a campaign. They had to learn how to target their demographics correctly. And then they had to actually implement that and then use the data that they were gathering in order to make that work.
Yeah. Now, we had a number of near misses as well, of course. So we won 4 seats, but there were a number of other seats where Muslim candidates came very close, or pro-Gaza Muslim candidates came very close. Ilford North, Bethnal Green and Stepney, Bradford West, Birmingham, Yardley,
Slough.
Go through those seats. Why did we lose those seats and win others?
Well, I think when you look at the actual complete scenario that we have in this country, I think the seats that we lost with near misses are actually more instructive than the seats that we won.
Really?
Yeah, because the seats that we won, we can put down to, very favorable demographics. For example, Dewsbury and Batley, right? So Dewsbury and Batley, the Muslim population consists of about 46 or 47% of that area. Okay? And the way they ran their campaign without much competition or without many splits, it was almost inevitable that that would be a victory seat for us. And that was proved to be correct, because I think they won by about 7,000 or 8,000 votes. Yeah. So that in itself was something that we were banking upon and something that was proved to be right. However, in some of the near misses, the Muslim demographics were not that favorable, right? So we had about 25 to 30% of the electoral populace in some of those seats, like Slough, Ilford North. Ilford South was slightly better, I think. Leicester South was about the same level. So in those seats, to perform in the way that we did was actually quite remarkable. Because we know we just not had to get the Muslim electorate vote, but we had to get a subsection of the non-Muslim vote in some of those areas as well. And that's where the running of a campaign, the efficiency of a campaign, the way your targeting works in specific wards, not in other wards, was actually the thing that kind of bore fruit in some of those areas.
Yeah, so tell me about, one such campaign, I suppose, is Leanne Mohamad. Leanne came on this show a few weeks ago before the election. And, it seems to me that her seat in particular was a very challenging seat, because you had a fewer number of Muslim voters in comparison to, say, Yardley or Dewsbury and Batley, certainly. And you had a large number of conservative voters, which these other seats don't really have. Like how, and she got within, 528 votes to victory. And it was against probably one of the most important Labour cabinet members, Wes Streeting. Tell me about, how do you see that the feat or her ability to achieve such a result?
Well, I think Leanne is one person that's throughout this campaign has probably transcended being just a candidate, really, in terms of the social exposure that she got, in terms of the nature of her candidacy is something that was almost a flagship for the whole campaign throughout the country, really. It is something that I don't think, with respect to all of the other candidates that we saw in any of the candidates, is the amount of interest that she generated. Now, that's because of her personality, because of her background, because of her age, because of, kind of that connection with the youth vote, because of what she represented, because of going against Wes Streeting. It was like a trifecta of factors that came together to make Leanne's candidature the way it was. So I think that Ilford North seat was, as we were discussing, I think previous to this, previous to the elections, I think I expressed to you the hard nature of winning in that seat, right? So the way it was set up, not as favorably as, let's say, some of the other seats, the Birmingham seats or Dewsbury.
Yeah.
And to get within 500 votes within a whisker of unseating perhaps the second in command of the Labour Party is quite a remarkable achievement. Yeah. For that, I think Leanne had to do a number of things. Firstly, it was to run a campaign that was highly, highly optimized. And if you think about the campaign, to run a highly optimized campaign from a standing start, without electoral capital, without the electoral cycle data that she never had, yeah, without the know-how that she never had, it was all learned on the spot, on the job almost, in effect. Yeah. And to do that and then to galvanize that and to galvanize the vote in so many ways is quite a phenomenal achievement. Yeah. To be honest, I never thought that she would come that close. You know, I can, you know, hold my hands up. Well, perhaps you did, but I think you were probably too invested in that campaign to say that. But from the outside, looking at it from a bird's eye view, I thought she would be about 2,000 or 3,000 votes short, right? And then to make up those 2,000 or 3,000 votes with primarily a non-Muslim vote base is quite remarkable for somebody like Leanne on the pro-Gaza issue. Because if you look at the constituency, Ilford North, it is not really a how shall I say, where the progressive vote base is, because that's probably in Holborn, St Pancras, probably in Islington, and so forth. Ilford North tends to be one of the outlying areas there. So to make up that vote base is a testament really to that campaign. And I know Salma, who ran the campaign, who actually ran it in many ways better than normal campaigns, better than a Labour campaign in many ways. And I think what aided Leanne also was the London effect as well, where people were gravitating around that candidature to understand that, look, this is against West Streeting. Yeah. There's a young Palestinian girl who, it still amazes me when I say that she's 23 years old. I mean, it's just mind-boggling sometimes, you know, to reckon that somebody who's 23 years old could unseat West Streeting in that manner. Yeah. And really, you know, that's something that we should take heart in and something that we should look for the future, you know, in terms of exploiting that.
Can we talk about split votes, in particular Birmingham Hall Green? Now, you and I sat down, we met some people in Birmingham, actually, and I want to talk a little bit about Birmingham because, of course, you know, you and I invested a lot of time in having conversations with people in Birmingham about those various seats. Hall Green is one of them, Tahir Ali's seat from the Labour Party. We had two candidates and they cancelled each other out. Tell me about that and about just the split vote effect across the country.
Well, I think if you look at Birmingham, the way I always look to analyze Birmingham is the spine of Birmingham, really, which I call the spine, which is the 4 seats within that runs from the north to the south of Birmingham.
So these are...
Which is Birmingham Perry Bar, Birmingham Ladywood, Birmingham Hall Green, and Just Phillips' seat, which I call Yardley, right? Yeah. So those 4 seats are the ones where, to be honest, we should be winning quite easily, right? So those 4 seats are ripe for, you know, for a Muslim vote, for an independent candidate.
High concentration
demographics, and the one that is the most favourable amongst them is Hall Green.
Yeah,
I remember some months ago we were having these conversations with some of the people in Birmingham, and people were slightly disaffected by it, saying, well, they've got huge majority. Shabana Mahmood's got a huge majority in Ladywood. Jess Phillips has got a huge majority. Tahir Ali had the biggest majority in Hall Green. And those things cannot be overturned in one electoral cycle. I think we've kind of proved that theory wrong in many ways, right? So I think the thing is, if the community do get together, if they understand the issues that are at play, they understand the demographic leverage that they have in some of those seats, is very much achievable, as we've seen, right? So Perry Bar was an example. Perry Bar with Khalid Mahmood, an unpopular MP that we looked at. The seats were set up in such a way, so we had a candidate who became independent, I think Ayub Khan, just before the elections, and that seat was right for the taking, and then it was taken, right? So then we look at Hall Green. Now, Hall Green is a seat that really we should have won, right, in many ways. It's a travesty that we didn't win it. Now, the split vote factor came in quite, quite drastically against our intentions there. The two candidates that were around then, so we had Hafiz and then we had Afsar, right? So both had independent credentials to them. Now, both were wanting to stand to that seat. Now, we had this same situation in a number of places. We had the same situation in Dewsbury as well, up until a few weeks before the elections. But they actually managed to resolve their differences with Ammar Anwar and with Iqbal Mohamad on the other side. And it was a testament to them that they actually resolved those differences a couple of weeks before the election cycle began.
Absolutely.
But in Hall Green, unfortunately, we did not. And if you look at the combination of the votes that Afsar received and for Hafiz receiving those votes, the combination of those votes meant that they could have actually won that seat quite comfortably. Why that has happened and why people were so stubborn and, not able to resolve their differences, I think we have to look at in a bit more detail. I think it depends on local factors. It depends on people's attitudes in not coming together. And it depends upon how amenable they are to outside influences to try and bring them together as well.
Yeah.
I think there's a number of things that are involved there that we need to ascertain and look at in a bit more in a deeper sense to figure out how can we resolve these things earlier on, because that would make a lot of difference to us.
Can I ask you about Bradford West? So that was a seat where the independent candidate, Mohamad Ali, came very close to unseating Naz Shah from the Labour Party. Very, very close. And I spoke to some of the independent movement in Bradford West, and they didn't necessarily run like a slick campaign, yet they got very close. I mean, any thoughts about Bradford?
Yeah, so I would say that in Bradford is something that we never really talked about during this course of the campaign, because people assumed that Naz Shah had such a insurmountable majority that there was no reflection of any independent candidature there. And it was a seat that was not actually really talked about, even during the Muslim vote or during the campaign or anything else like that. The campaign wasn't public facing. It wasn't as slick as Leanne's campaign, let's say, for example.
Yeah.
And people also felt that the community in Bradford were almost kind of set in their ways as well.
The
right?
Brotherly
vote. The Brotherly vote,
yeah.
the vote along mosque endorsements and the vote along Brotherly lines. It was so much set in their ways that people felt that this thing could never, impinge upon that, right? However, we saw that a candidate who was, to be quite honest, not really very well known, a candidate whose campaign was missing a lot of the key components that a lot of the other campaigns had, yet still managed to get such a high proportion of the votes. What's interesting about Bradford West is Bradford South, was it?
Bradford West.
Bradford West. Bradford West is the fact that there was a drop in Labour vote of about 44%.
Wow.
And that's the highest drop of Labour vote anywhere in the country.
Really?
Right?
Which is Naz Shah's constituency.
This is Naz Shah's constituency.
Wow.
Exactly. And that despite the fact that Naz Shah actually voted for the ceasefire.
Yes.
Right? Okay, so before there was this discussion about, if MPs voted for the ceasefire, should we leave them in place?
Wow.
Should we not stand any independent candidates against them? And I was very firmly, as you know, against that idea, because there's almost a guilt by association to the Labour Party that I think we should really understand. So Naz Shah losing 44% of the Labour drop in that vote is actually a massive issue, right?
Were there too many independent candidates? I mean, looking back, you're talking about targeting, having 20 to 25 seats where you can actually put forward an independent. But we had Sam Habib in Ealing, we had, Newcastle, Yvonne Ridley. We had people placing themselves as independent candidates all over the country. Was that a mistake?
So I think when we were looking at some of the seats to target, when we talked about identifying these 25 seats, none of those seats were in that 25. Right. And the reason for that was the demographics didn't play in that manner. And I think what was more appropriate at that time was to make people understand where there were viable chances of victory, and also make sure that people understand where there's unviable chances of victory. Right. So, for example, we spoke to the people in Oxford East. We spoke about the Newcastle candidate. We spoke about Ealing, I think it is, right? Sam Habib. And we said, look, there is actually not a very good chance of victory there.
I mean, I told Sam Habib this very early on, but it's impossible for him to win that seat.
Yeah, and similar with Yvonne Ridley in Newcastle as well.
Yeah.
You know, those seats are not very winnable on just the Gaza ticket. Because what you'll find is that the Gaza ticket, and again, I'm going to make no apologies for this, right, appeals a lot to the Muslim sense and to the Muslim value set, right? So you can go after those votes knowing that you can transfer those votes from Labour into that. For progressives, yes, it does make a difference. Like, for example, Andrew Feinstein did really well against Keir Starmer, right? But in areas where there isn't that massive progressive vote, it's very difficult to convert. So we need to understand that. And it's also a question of allocation of resources. Because if we do concentrate our efforts on certain seats, it makes a world of difference. But if we spread ourselves too thinly across the board, then it makes a massive difference, because your resources are then kind of used up in areas where there is actually no effect. And we saw that with Leanne's campaign as well, for example, because in London, we knew that not all of the London seats are viable as victory targets, right? So there's certain seats like Tower Hamlets, Ilford North, Ilford South are very viable, right? But in certain other seats, like some of the South London seats, there is not really a great chance of victory. Because London is such a concentrated area, you could have that transference of resources from some of those areas into, let's say, Ilford North, Ilford South.
People didn't get that. You didn't get that impression. I mean, the Palestinian community were all worried about Ealing North, which was an unviable seat, and Sam Habib shouldn't have stood in that seat. And, you know, and so they gravitated to that, and yet let Leanne Mohamad, who's probably the most important Palestinian candidate to stand, didn't give her very many resources at all.
So that's where data comes in, right? Okay, because if people don't understand what's viable and what's not viable, then that kind of thing is going to happen, and people are just going to go on their emotional instincts, if you like, in terms of working that through. I think the other thing is that when we look at some of these seats, resources was a definite problem across the country.
People to knock on doors.
People to knock on doors, especially the canvassing aspect of it. Not so much the social media aspect of it, but in terms of canvassing on doors, because that is something that the Muslim community is not used to. It's not used to going up and knocking on doors and asking for votes, right? And that's something we had to train people in throughout the campaign. That's something that required a lot of effort in order to get people out and doing things. In many constituencies, like our constituencies, for example, in Luton North, Luton South, we were very short of resources, right? And that's something that needs to be addressed in terms of how we understand that, because you don't find Labour volunteers shying away from doing such things, right? But as a Muslim community, and this is where electoral capital comes in, because we didn't have the know-how. We didn't have the training. We didn't understand what it means for people to volunteer, what's required of them, and how they should go about their business. And that's been a big learning experience for us in order to plan future campaigns moving forward.
Can I ask you about, I mean, someone who I believe is a maverick, you know, a charlatan, probably I've called him in the past. I mean, I believe he played a very destructive role in this campaign, George Galloway. George Galloway lost his seat in Rochdale, and the Workers' Party got 0 across the country. What's your reflections on, I know I've now loaded this question up, but what's your reflections on the idiocy, I think, of the Workers' Party and George Galloway?
Yet, when you look at the start of the campaign, what was the talk about? The talk was about the Workers' Party, right? The talk was about, why should you even have independent candidates when you've got the Workers' Party standing in a number of these seats? That was the talk of the town at that stage. It was about, well, the Workers' Party have already stood up candidates. Why do you need to split the vote and have independent candidates? Right? Why isn't the Workers' Party sufficient for you? Those were the conversations that were happening just at the start of the campaign. And I'm glad people saw through that, right, to a certain extent. In some constituencies, they actually didn't, right? And some people were minded to side with the Workers' Party.
They split the vote.
They split the vote, exactly. And we can see the results of that, because the Workers' Party at the moment is nowhere to be seen, right? They don't have one candidature. And the reason they stood up so many candidates who were not vetted, who were basically anybody who would just put their hand out and say, I want to become a Workers' Party candidate, was allowed to stand. One of the foremost reasons for that was because of George Galloway's belief that he could get, I think it was about 150,000 votes across the country, where he'd be then access to short money, which is a pot of money that some parties can get with one seat and 150,000 votes. Yet that didn't occur for him either.
Yeah.
So the Workers' Party effect was actually very noticeable in some constituencies. Less so in others, where the Workers' Party candidate let themselves down by themselves. So, for example, in Slough, I remember there was a Workers' Party candidate that stood against Azhar Chauhan. But the fact was that the candidate was very weak, but still they made massive attempts to try and make the candidate stand down, to have a unity candidate.
Yeah.
And it still didn't work out. I think there was agreement, then there was disagreement, and then negation on agreements. And the candidate still stood up, but again, that had minimal effect because the candidate was so weak.
Yeah.
However, in certain other constituencies, for example, in Luton North or in Luton South, the Workers' Party did have an impact upon the independent candidature. And that was because the Workers' Party candidate was almost some way ingrained within the community. So we have this age-old thing about brotherly links coming through, and some of them actually got about 2,000 or 3,000 votes. Still not beating the independent candidate, but still enough to spoil the actual result for the rest of the populace.
Yeah. And by extension, can I talk about the left in general? So we had some really well-meaning candidates, Emma Dent Coad in Kensington, who was formerly the Labour candidate. We had Pamela Fitzpatrick, who again was formerly the Labour candidate, who stood on an independent ticket in Harrow West. There are a number of left candidates in Stratford, in the Stratford seat. These candidates did pretty badly in those seats. I mean, yet they were hailed by the left as being the most important candidates in London, for example. Why did the left fail so miserably?
I think it just goes to show that the left by itself, without the tag of a major political party like Labour Party or the Workers' Party, is actually very fractured. It actually doesn't hold much weight certainly in terms of the Muslim electorate anyway, right? So we saw Emma Dent Coad go from, I think, 16,000 votes to about 1,000 votes, which is a massive drop.
Yeah.
Considering the fact that she's a pro-Gaza candidate, considering the fact that she's standing in a seat which is full of progressives, considering that has a sizable Muslim demographic in that seat, and yet for 1,000 votes, that's an enormous drop for her. And similarly with Pamela Fitzpatrick, who had a lot of support from various Muslim organizations in Harrow West, but yet still the actual result didn't prove that way. Yeah. Which just goes to show that I think in terms of when we look at electoral politics and we look at the Muslim constituency as a whole throughout the country, it's very important to understand, and it's very important to understand the confidence that we should have in our own selves, right? We've gone from many electoral cycles in the past where we've never had confidence in our own abilities to represent ourselves. Yeah. We've gone from a state of, almost, we've been anesthetized into thinking that Labour is our only option, right? That we cannot achieve anything unless we're on the back of this party, okay? So this electoral cycle has actually disproved that thesis in a big way. And it's actually disproved the thesis of the Workers' Party in a big way. Yeah. So we need to just maintain that confidence moving forward, because that confidence is something that doesn't arise just by itself. It arises with, the work that the campaign teams have done up and down the country, and it's something that should be further embellished moving forward.
Can it be sustained? I mean, of course, you talked about the Gaza vote, right? And Gaza, subhanAllah, it still remains a massive issue. But of course, in 5 years' time, we hope and pray. Of course, it's destroyed, but we hope and pray that, it's no longer going to be the challenge that it is today. Are you confident that without Gaza, the Muslim community can still maintain this independent course?
Yeah, so I think there's a number of factors or a number of challenges facing us now moving forward. Because it's not just us who have recognized our potential, right? So it's not just we sitting here and analyzing the numbers and thinking what a great job we've done and we've got 4 candidates in and a number of near misses. It's not just us who have kind of seen that picture, if you like. Yeah. So our opponents in the Labour Party, in the Tory Party, even in the Workers' Party or on the left, have seen that picture as well. Yeah. So for them, it's just as much of an issue. Now, there's a number of factors leading up to this. One is the Gaza issue. So people are hoping on the left, on the Labour Party, that this is just a protest vote, right? So that is going to dissipate within the next few months, if not the next few years, definitely.
Yeah.
I think this is more born out of hope from their part rather than any deep understanding of where the Muslim community is.
Yeah.
Because I think more important than the Gaza issue is the issue of confidence within the Muslim community itself. So the Gaza issue was a catalyst for us to behave in this manner.
Yeah.
It was a catalyst for us to drive that confidence within ourselves.
Yeah.
And a number of people did that in a number of these constituencies, the candidates that won and the candidates that lost. So they drove that confidence within the Muslim community to think that actually you do have a voice. Actually, you do have leverage over electoral politics. Actually, you can make a difference. And that's something that's hard to take away. It's not something that can be automatically taken away when the issue dissipates, because that is galvanized around confidence. It's not galvanized around the issue of Gaza. The issue of Gaza is a catalyst to that confidence, but the confidence is a more deep-seated, embedded view in the Muslim community.
So you're basically saying that we managed to win 4 independents and we had near misses in, nigh on
4 or 5, yeah.
4 or 5 seats. And that in itself gives that confidence. Because it's true. And when I traveled up and down the country, I found that a lot of people just didn't believe this independent message. Now it's hard not to believe that message, right?
Exactly. So when we were going up and down the country, often the questions that we got were, well, should we actually side with the Greens? Should we actually side with the Lib Dems? And the reasons that people were making those statements were not because they somehow believed in those political parties. Is because they had an extreme lack of confidence within themselves, within mobilizing the Muslim vote in their specific areas. And that's something that's just been thrown wide open now. So the old electoral way of doing things and to attaching yourselves to parties of any hue or color has now been, firmly displaced. So the independent candidature now is a very viable option moving forward. There are some challenges about split votes and how to galvanize around one candidate, and that still exists in many ways. But I think that whole issue about, well, we don't have confidence in an independent candidate has actually now been gone, right? Because the way people worked before was the fact that just the mention of an independent candidate would almost be akin to failure, right? So people were saying, well, that actually never works before, does never work going forward, and it will never work moving into the future because the electoral system in this country is not set up for that.
There is an impression that the Labour Party is on a mission to win back those those Muslim voters. And there are Muslim groups who are in fact making overtures to the Labour Party. And if the Labour Party invited them in, the Labour government invited them in, they would be knocking on their doors and sitting at the table once again. That's a challenge. How are we going to deal with that challenge?
Yeah, so I see the challenge on 2 fronts, really. So one is that, which is the way the Labour Party have always tried to manipulate the Muslim vote, for example, bringing in the so-called quote-unquote influentials within the community into their tent, right? And then to exploit them. So the way that we've been anesthetized to this, the way they've put through counterposing arguments against some of our complaints has actually led to some of this moving forward. Now, that is going to continue, but it's probably going to continue in an accelerated manner with the Labour Party moving forward, because they have seen the results of not doing so. They have seen the results of actually sidelining the Muslim community in many ways. So that's something that we have to be really aware of. The way to counteract that is, I think, to be aware of it, firstly, and then to set up our own institutions whereby we can actually represent our voices moving forward with that confidence. So, for example, the independent groups that have set up in some of these constituencies are actually still in place. They're actually there to move forward on various issues going through. So it's not just about Gaza. The independent networks that are in these constituencies that actually chose the candidates, that actually ran the campaign, that actually stood for those elections, are actually not disbanded. They're actually there to move forward. And that's one of the ways that we can address some of these issues. The other aspect, I think, which is equally important, is the fact that people have recognized that the concentrations of Muslims is what forms a problem especially in first past the post in terms of the demographics that we have in this country. And that's something, I don't know how they will try and challenge that, because it's something very difficult to challenge from their point of view, but it's something that we should certainly be aware of. So for example, more policies to do with integration, more policies to do with a more diverse mix within our communities, even more gentrification of some of our areas, for example. So those are the things that we need to be aware of, and we need to understand what's at play here, and why things are moving in the direction they are.
I mean, there were some boundary changes prior to the election, and those boundary changes generally worked in our favour.
Exactly.
Dewsbury and Batley came together as one seat. Previously, they were part of two seats.
That's right. Ilford North.
Wow.
The two Muslim wards came into West Streeting's area, right?
Yes.
Which actually helped Leanne's campaign.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Potentially, you're saying, but like the American system where they manipulate those boundaries, potentially that could happen here. I know it's run by the Electoral Commission and they're an independent body, but it's very possible and plausible that.
Yeah, I don't think the boundary changes are going to come into that much effect, because they've already just made boundary changes just now.
Yeah.
So they don't really make those boundary changes that often, right? So it's probably a cycle of 20, 30 years when the population changes in different directions. So each constituency is around about 70 to 80,000 electorate at the moment. So that's how they've evened it out.
Yeah.
I think what's more likely to occur, and again, this is just my opinion, is the fact that it's the deconcentration of the Muslim populace in some ways. And I don't know how they will achieve that, because it's something that's very difficult for them to achieve, because we as a community like to stick together. Even if we become affluent, we still like to live in the same sort of areas. So that's something very difficult to achieve. But I can see policies being ingrained that would actually maybe inject other people in, maybe gentrify some areas. For example, Tower Hamlets and Bethnal Green, for example, is probably ripe for gentrification. Some of those areas may come into being in that manner. But it's something very difficult to address. But I think that's certainly a challenge. It's something we need to be aware of.
Can I speak to you about the challenges these independent candidates face? So we've got 4 Muslim independents, 5 including Jeremy Corbyn. It's true to say that there wasn't much work done on the quality of the candidates prior to them being selected as candidates. And in many respects, some of those candidates became candidates at the very last minute, right? So we're going to see variable quality, and certainly I think they would admit it. They're not necessarily political beings. They don't have a political background, some of them at least. How do you think they're going to fare, and what challenges lay ahead for them?
So I think, again, we've seen a number of these candidates, right? So, and a number of them have their strengths and a number of them have their weaknesses as well. I think what's important to remember about a candidate is not necessarily the person in front of you. It's what he brings to the table, right? So, for example, in Dewsbury and Batley, it is very important for that candidate to be of a certain persuasion. For example, there's a big Gujarati Muslim community, there's a big Pakistani Muslim community.
He's got no political experience, Iqbal. I mean, to be frank.
Exactly. But I think what he brought to the table in terms of unifying that region was the background maybe that he had, because he was a Gujarati from a Brailvi background, for example, as I was told, right? So that kind of galvanizes 2 communities in one without any much headache. But what that does is that dilutes the nature of the person then moving forward, right? And we saw something that I wasn't particularly happy with, in my opinion, was, for example, the oath taking in Parliament, right? Whereby I think we could have made more of a statement in terms of how we take that oath, right? And in terms of protests, a bit like the SDLP candidate.
Clive Lewis or something.
Exactly. Clive Lewis or the SDLP candidate. And I don't think it befits a Muslim to just accept that oath for what it is, right? People may agree or disagree with that. Now, the thing is, the candidate himself is probably going to gain experience as they go along Parliament. They're going to see many hurdles, but it's really how they qualify to handle those hurdles that makes a difference, right? So some you can see are maybe a bit more apt than some of the others. So, for example, Shaukat Adam seems to be a bit more apt in terms of how to handle some of the challenges that they may face. Some are, as you say, a bit, naive politically, for example. And so those are going to be things that we are going to face. But also, I think it's important to understand that the success or the failure of the candidates is what people will look to when the next election cycle comes along, right? So if there are gaping mistakes made by some of these candidates, that will be set upon by the opponents of this movement to say, well, you selected these Muslim candidates, they came into parliament, they compromised a lot of values, we're back to square one. What use was it? What use was 4 candidates, in a small protest vote, but not actually achieving much? Where did it lead us to, right? So that's something that we need to be really careful about, and that's something those candidates have to be very mindful about moving forward.
So we're wrapping up now. I want to understand, you and I were quite involved in this campaign, and I think it's fair to say you and I come from a perspective where, we've been very skeptical and critical of the system. There are people out there who say that we should not be engaging with the system, because the more you encourage engagement in the system, the more you suck people into a corrupt architecture. I mean, how would you respond to that?
Yeah, I would say I think there's 2 elements to that, as me and you well know. One is a shara element, that is it permissible to do something or not to do something, right? So I guess we take the opinion that from a shara perspective, that is permissible to do it. And then I think the second element is it politically sensible to do something like this or not, right? Does it further your cause? Does it further your agenda? Does it further the agendas of the community at all, right? Many of the arguments that we heard on the doorstep were like, well, actually an independent MP is not going to make any difference. He doesn't belong to the governing party. He doesn't even belong to the opposition. It's just going to be a protest vote. It's just going to be a couple of questions in parliament. What good is that going to do, right? Okay. So I think there's 2 ways to look at it. Firstly, it's what could this movement achieve? So as we talked about 20-25 seats moving into the future, right? So if you take yourself to a place where we have 20-25 seats in parliament, right? Suddenly that becomes a very viable block in parliament, okay? You have a massive Labour majority at the moment, but as all commentators have said, that it's a very shallow majority. A lot of those seats in future electoral cycles are prone to be lost by the Labour Party. In which case, you have a much thinner majority moving into a future Labour government. When you have a thin majority, a bloc or a caucus of 20 seats suddenly becomes much more influential moving forward in terms of the leverage that it can have, not just on domestic issues, but also on foreign policy issues, right? And you can gain a lot of momentum doing that. Even if that was not done, even if the Labour majority stood the test of time, the very fact that you have a caucus of 20 seats to represent Muslim concerns and to represent for intents and purposes, a Muslim voice, in effect is something to behold in itself, right? Because although you don't have power to change policy, you do have representation. And as you know, in parliaments up and down the world, all over the place, even if they don't have the voting numbers or the voting calculus to make a difference in policy, a significant caucus or a bloc is something that everybody fears. The governing party fears and the opposition party fears. And that's the way I think we have to look at it.
Riaz, to finish off, we've probably invested, shy of 6-7 months in this, and you and I have spent a long time talking about the different seats, and we've been in conversation with lots of seats. I mean, what could we have done better, do you think?
Yeah, well, I think we could have done a lot better, but we could have done a lot worse as well. I think that's the way to look at it. I think to expect perfection in the way that we've carried out this campaign in the 6 weeks is really, people who say that, you've made this mistake and you've made that mistake and you've got split the vote in Birmingham Hall Green and this has happened and that has happened, is I think people picking at the sides and picking at the peripheries. I think when we look at the universal movement to stand up independent candidates, I think it's been a wholehearted success. There are some things we could have done better. There are elements of campaigns up and down the country. I'm collecting feedback from a number of sources at the moment of what people have done, and there is vagaries in terms of what some people did, what other people did, some of the techniques that people used. Some worked, some didn't work. And those are to be expected because we're only humans in terms of running this campaign. And as we said at the start, we're going from a standing start. So it was an immense learning curve. And I think in the future, we need to understand how to use this data, how to use that feedback, and how to use it for future electoral cycles. Because our previous stuff to this was always on the back of a Labour Party movement.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the way to look at it. And I think people who complain about some of the mistakes that we've made really need to understand the bigger picture here, really need to understand that it's not really some of those minute mistakes that we've made, but it's understanding what the achievement has been and not looking past that achievement.
Actually, I've got one final question for you, Riaz, and that's about our experience, what we've learned here. Can that experience be transposed, or can we help other countries and other Muslims in other countries to learn from some of the practical experiences that we've been through here?
Yeah, sure. I think it's probably applicable just to Western countries, the Muslim populace in various Muslim countries, in Western countries, not so applicable to obviously Muslim majority countries.
Yeah.
In Western countries, I think there are certain peculiarities to the UK and the UK electoral system which can't be replicated in other places.
Yeah.
France, people have a very hard time. So it's hard to imagine a situation whereby Muslims can have the amount of representation and the amount of influence over the electoral politics that we have here.
Right.
And it's traditionally not been the case that Muslims have had that experience in France, for example. In the United States, as we well know, there's a well-meaning abandoned Biden campaign. But as you also well know, in terms of my opinions on that, I think what the United States suffers from is the lack of the demographic concentration that we have here. Yeah. And that's actually quite telling in the United States. So if you take, for example, the highest majority Muslim populace in the States, which is Michigan. Michigan has about, the Muslim populace consists of about only 5% of the electoral population in Michigan. Yeah. Now, I know people argue about the fact that, Biden won that by, I think, 100,000 votes, and there's 100,000 Muslims in Michigan. However, it's not the same 100,000 people that caused that 100,000 victory, which is quite important to understand. And people sometimes miscommunicate that and don't fully appreciate that.
Yeah.
So it's really understanding what they can and can't do in some of their electoral cycles, really. It's very limited, if I'm perfectly honest. I don't think it's as extensive as the kind of opportunity that we have here or the amount of influence that we can kind of portray here. I think there are certain learnings, though, that they can take. For example, I've been talking to the people in Slough, where a lot of the councillors resigned en masse and then worked actually with the independent campaign to get that independent campaign very close to victory. However, there's this issue of reciprocity that I think we all need to be aware of, that when people come and help us on the campaign, are people expecting something back in return after the campaign is over? And that's something that we have to be aware of, not just here, but in the States and everywhere else that we're engaged in local politics or everything else. It's the trade-offs, really. We'll help you on this front, but you need to help us on that front. And that's something that needs to be carefully managed, because if we don't carefully manage that, sometimes we can lose our compass and in terms of our direction of what we're trying to do. So that's something very important to kind of export out to the rest of the Muslim population. And I think we need to have further conversations, especially in terms of the Muslims in the States, to understand what are viable options for them. And we can tell them that, look, when we had viable options, we tried to exploit them, and this is how far we got, and we actually achieved some success. But we also had unviable options where it was important for us not to waste our resources on some of those unviable options moving forward. So I think those are the things that we can kind of make them learn from.
Okay. Riaz Hasan, Jazakallah khair. Thank you very much for your time.
Jazakallah khair. Assalamu alaikum.
Please remember to subscribe to our social media and YouTube channels, and head over to our website thinkingmuslim.com to sign up to my weekly newsletter. Jazakallah khair.